Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Yaba and Zeba, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Yaba Blay for the launch of her book, One Drop. Dr. Yaba Blay is a scholar, activist, and cultural creative whose work centers the lived experiences of Black women and girls. She has launched viral campaigns including #PrettyPeriod and #ProfessionalBlackGirl, and has appeared on CNN, BET, MSNBC, and NPR. Dr. Blay's work has been featured in the New York Times, Ebony, Essence, and The Root. A thought leader on Black racial identity, colorism, and beauty politics, she's a globally sought-after speaker and consultant. You can connect with her online at yabablay.com. Joining her in conversation is Zeba Blay. Zeba is a culture and film critic born in Ghana and based in NYC. The senior culture writer at Huffington Post, her words have also appeared in Film Comment, Essence, The New York Times, Shadow and Act, The Village Voice, and IndieWire. Her forthcoming book, Carefree Black Girls, comes out October 2021 from St. Martin's Press. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yaba Blay and Zeba Blay to the stage.
Oh my goodness. Oh my God. I have to say, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. I'm so honored. This book is brilliant.
Thank you.
Reading it has it's caused all these here's a question and here's another question, and here's another question, which is like what you want out of something like this. So it's kind of hard to know where to start. But I think where we can start from maybe is what made you want to work on this project to begin with?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, of course. I'm also honored to be in conversation with you, especially since folks are constantly confusing. I can't tell you how many times folks are reaching out to Zeba and reaching out to me. But yeah, I started this project in 2011, and I didn't think of it initially as a book project. I thought of it as a digital project. Generally speaking, my work focuses on colorism. You know, I did my dissertation on skin bleaching in Ghana. And for the most part, when we talk about colorism, we talk about it. Oh, where'd she go?
Oh, what happened?
I don't know. Don't leave me.
Oh, here. I'm sorry. Here I am.
For the most part, you know, when we talk about colorism, we talk about it by definition. We talk about the hierarchical perceptions of skin color and the value that's projected onto bodies based upon our proximity or distance from whiteness. And so in a lot of ways, we talk about the disadvantages that come with having dark skin, you know, in the context of white supremacy. And so that was where my center was. And then I want to say, was it 2010, 2011, I was on a panel for the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City. And the topic was colorism across the diaspora. And I was on the panel with Rosa Clemente. And Rosa kept identifying as a Black Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx. And I was so distracted, like, what you mean? Like, what's that? You know, because I'm looking at Rosa and I'm hearing her talk and I'm like, okay, I know Puerto Ricans. I've never heard a Puerto Rican identify as Black. They identify as Puerto Rican, right? But she was so pointed and just like, I'm a Black Puerto Rican from the South Bronx. And so, you know, we talked after, and then it just made me start thinking of so many experiences that I've had with folks on the lighter end of the spectrum, very much, of course, connected to my experience growing up dark-skinned in New Orleans. And New Orleans is absolutely a color-struck city, historically and contemporarily. So, you know, I knew I was dark-skinned before I knew how to spell my own middle name, you know, and it was just at the forefront of my reality, but I also had the experience of being rejected by folks based upon skin color, you know? And so anytime I would come into contact with folks who were light skinned, I had my own presumptions, you know, about who they were and how they were receiving me or not. And I know that that absolutely informed the ways that I interact with folks. And so hearing Rosa identify as Black and like claiming it, you know, like she has an Africa tattoo on her arm, you know, it really challenged me, I think, to start rethinking my own relationship to skin color politics, you know. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk to as many people like Rosa as I could. The thing that's interesting about the project is like it created a web of sorts. And again, since it started as a digital project, I'd be talking about it on Facebook and social media. And the more I talked about it, the more folks would be like, oh, you should talk to this person. You should talk to this person. You should talk to this person. So everyone in the book I was connected to personally in some way, you know, whether it was a friend or a contact who said, you should talk to my aunt or my whomever or this person. And so, yeah, I wanted to talk to as many people as I could who may not, quote unquote, look Black, but from their own lived experience and their own perspective were very clear and connected to a Black identity, regardless of the language that they use to self-identify.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me about the book. You know, whiteness is so small and it's so lazy, and it lacks imagination, because it's like you create this rubric for Blackness that really isn't about Blackness. It's about preserving whiteness. It's not interested in Black people at all. And yet it's a rubric that so many Black people subscribe to in some shape or form.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, in doing this project, the ways in which your ideas about how you define what Blackness is changed?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm coming out of Temple. I was trained at Temple. For those of you who don't know, Temple is the home of Afrocentricity. I got my PhD in African American studies there. And so, you know, we walking around, we not calling ourselves Black and white. We talking about Africans and Europeans, you know, with our dashikis on and such. And so I think I had an understanding of Blackness as a global identity. But again, that was limited to the places and the spaces that I navigated, you know, and it was also limited to what I had read about, that it wasn't until I physically left America to go other places, right, that I saw it differently. What's interesting, I didn't see it so much going to Ghana, but I'll put a plug in that, right? But like going to Puerto Rico or going to Brazil, right? Or going to other places in the Caribbean and recognizing that, wait a minute, like the images that they're showing us on TV, that's not necessarily the reality. So I think what happens is when we sit in this limited space and we rely upon the media to show us ourselves, right? Which is also by design, we come to take on this notion of being a minority when in fact we really aren't.
You're not the minority at all.
Me going to Brazil and literally, again, being distracted because I'm seeing all of these people who look like me, my complexion, you know, that's not the Brazil we get on TV, you know? So I think, and I wouldn't say that it was just this project. So just to start, I would say I always had a global idea of Blackness, but again, I think that was absolutely color coded, right? So even though I can say, yes, there is a diaspora, yes, there are Black people all over the world, my idea of those Black people would be to have those experiences, to see people who look like me and be able to quickly recognize that as Black, but not recognizing that there are people who lived on the other end of the spectrum who also still identified as Black. And again, this is absolutely shaded by my experience in New Orleans, where there are people who are of African descent, but who identify as Creole.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So I live with this idea, this notion that if people had the opportunity to identify as something other than Black, that they would, right? If there was other languaging, you know, so if we're saying these folks are Latino, Latina, Latinx, that's not Black. the ways that I understood it, you know, so this notion that there were other categories that people could occupy that was not Black. And so this project in a lot of ways helped me to, like, in a lived way, see that the ways in which our identities are so much intersectional, but also to recognize that all of us are struggling to understand Blackness because we are relying upon people who are not Black to define it for us. So what the project really does in a lot of ways for me, everyone in the book is used to being questioned, right? So folks are asking them, what are you? Where are you from? Who are your people, right? Based upon their appearances. Nobody's ever asked me what I am. You know, they might hear my name or see my name and ask me, you know, are you from Africa or where are your people from, kind of thing, but no questions of my Blackness. So I've never been put in a position to have to define my Blackness. But as folks who don't, quote unquote, look Black are constantly being challenged. And so it's from their perspective that we're even able to get this articulation of what Blackness is or what their identity is. And so for me, I think it allowed me in a real way, not just theoretical, right? Not just what books and articles, but from lived experience, opening myself up to speak to people who don't look like me, right? Yet see themselves connected to me, I think was absolutely part and parcel of how I came to expand, I think, my understandings of Blackness as a global identity.
Yeah, and I think the book does a really amazing job of asking me, the reader, to think, you know, intentionally about how I identify and how did I form these identities and definitions of my own Blackness,
right?
Which I think is so important.
Right. Let me ask you then, Zeba.
Okay.
I know your background, folks may not know as much, but how do you identify?
I identify as Ghanaian and Black. I was born in Ghana. I grew up mostly in pre-gentrified Jersey City, New Jersey, where, you know, the community was predominantly Black and Latinx. I grew up amongst Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who didn't identify as Black, but who used the word nigga, right? I grew up, it's interesting when we talk about like the formation of this idea of what Blackness is and sort of like how you form this identity, because of course I never questioned my Blackness being a dark-skinned black woman, but it was definitely like poked at in terms of like the way I speak, you know, the music I listened to, the way I dressed, in high school and elementary school, and yet I never internalized that. It never made me question my Blackness, because I could see how it was all a kind of performance and how it was all sort of arbitrary, and I was able to sort of cling to my own experience. And that's what's so great about the book, is that it reminds you that the experience of being a racialized person it's a collective experience, but it's also incredibly personal, you know? And that brings me to another question that I had with, you know, the book kind of calls on us as Black people to think about these things. But, you know, today, Vanity Fair released their Hollywood issue, which is like this big tentpole issue that they have every year. And who's on the cover is like always this really big deal. And you have the front fold, you have the second fold, and you have the third fold. And on the front fold, we have, you know, a smorgasbord of people and Zendaya front and center. On the third fold, we have Michaela Cole, which I found very interesting. You know, I'm a film and television critic, and I think in this realm, people talk so much about diversity and inclusion, and I just find it interesting that, you know, I was like, coming from your book, and I was thinking about like white people they want to talk about diversity and inclusion, but they don't want to talk about who they're including, right? It's like, of course, Zendaya is amazing and she's talented in all these things, but if we're talking about this, historically, light-skinned Black women have been the ones who have always been on the front cover.
Right.
So if we're talking about inclusion, why aren't we putting Michaela on the cover? And it's not just colorism. Colorism is a symptom of a larger thing, you know? So can you talk about like sort of like the implication that's being made towards white people in also thinking about what Blackness is?
Sure. You know, I do work in the realm of diversity, inclusion, belonging, whatever the language is at the time. And I would say that I probably take a more radical approach because I'm not here to make white people feel comfortable, right? Because I know that change is not ever going to happen if white people are comfortable within white supremacy, right? So oftentimes what I know just in terms of like fielding people's emails and inquiries of like me coming in to speak and so on and so forth. What I know, particularly in this moment, right? Because 2020 was such an interesting moment to the COVID, quarantine, George Floyd's assassination. Now everybody wants to be woke, right? Now, you know, Black Lives Matter again. Now Black squares on Instagram. Now everybody wants to read How to Be an Anti-Racist. Now all the white people want you to come and speak, right? But what I know is that they want credit for having you come and speak so that they can say that they're doing diverse work. But what they also want is a how-to manual. What they also want is a checklist. Come in and tell us how not to get in trouble, right? What words do we use, right? What is it that we're supposed to be doing so that we don't get in trouble? Not and teach us so we can rethink what we know, so that we can unlearn, so that we can, you know, think critically about the world that we live in and our relationship to white supremacy and how we are functioning as agents of white supremacy, but tell us how not to get in trouble. And so when we're talking about media makers, content creators, image makers, folks who project imagery, media, film, music, so on and so forth, again, you get a check for having a Black person, but also wanting to reiterate that Zendaya and Michaela are both Black, but which one are you comfortable with and why? So we have to have a conversation. Like you said, it's not just about colorism, but looking at colorism as a symptom of white supremacy, right? So again, you want credit for doing diverse work. You want not to get in trouble, but how do I do this work in a way that I remain comfortable? And so what's comfortable are working with folks, projecting folks who have a proximity to whiteness, still Black, but more like me than not.
Yeah.
You know, and so again, it's long-lived, you know, and until folks engage colorism as a symptom of white supremacy, not removed from, because a lot of times when we talk about colorism, folks act like it's us. This is what Black folks do to themselves. Disconnected from a longer history.
It's what you did to us, yeah.
This is the lens through which we are being forced to see ourselves, given how white supremacy, you know, manifests in creation. So, yeah.
Sorry, the dogs are like having a field day out there. I talked a little bit about, you know, growing up, Ghanaian, first gen, all that kind of stuff. I'm really interested in your experience. You know, you grew up in New Orleans, like that's very different from Jersey. You know, what has been your experience as in sort of like understanding your identity as both a Ghanaian person and a you know, an American person? Have you run into any conflict in terms of the gatekeeping that happens sometimes? I mean, and you know, this is all real. Like, it's like I'm not mad at it, you know, but you know, there's conversations to be had about Blackness.
You holding back on something. I'm gonna get it out of you. But I think there's something to be said about the first, and I think we use the language a little different because you identify as first gen and I identify as first gen as well. I think some folks might say that I'm second gen. I was born and raised in New Orleans, right? My parents immigrated to the States and I was born here. But I've always, and I don't know what your experience is, I've always felt like I'm somewhere in the middle, right? So for Black Americans, I'm African and different. For Ghanaians, I'm American and different, right? And it's always been hurtful, of course, painful, but frustrating. Like I remember going to Ghana as a teenager and being with my cousins hanging out. And again, having the experience that I've had, going to Ghana is going home, right? I'm finally going to a place where people know how to say my name with the right, intonation.
Inflection in there, yeah.
I'm going where everybody looks like, I'm going where I feel like I'm normal. And then I get there and everybody makes it a point to remind me that I'm not.
Oh no, you're American.
And so I remember being with my cousin, we're like weeks apart, same age, and we're out. And I'm like, yo, like, I don't understand. If I say nothing, we look like family. We look exactly alike. How do people know, just looking at me, that I'm not American, that I'm not Ghanaian, allegedly? And so he's like, okay, watch those people get in that cab. And so like, we're outside. We're watching, and the folks get into the cab head first.
Yep.
He said, how do you get in the cab? And I'm like, my body first. He's like, it's the smallest things, right? It's how you move. It's how you smell, right? It's how you interact with people. You don't have to say anything for people to know that how you move through the world is different, And so for me, identity-wise, I had to come to a place where, again, as you say, in a lot of ways, identity is personal, but it's also political, right? So Ghanaians may not accept me as fully Ghanaian, and that's fine, but my identity is not based upon their permission. Right? Same on the other side, Black Americans may not see me as American in that regard, but my identity is not predicated on them giving me permission to be who I am. And so I feel like the ways in which I have always seen Blackness as a global identity has really been out of a personal space of wanting to make sure that I can connect with more people than not. Like I can't afford to singularly say I'm American born Ghanaian and therefore I'm only like all the other American. How many of us? I mean, I know it's a gang of us, but still, how many who would be my community? Who would be my people? That I can't afford to have this very specific isolated silo of an identity, particularly when we understand Blackness as a political identity, when we understand that how we identify is how we engage with other people who look like us in the world and how the world sees us. Like many of us don't have a choice. Ultimately, you can call yourself Cablinasian all day long, Tiger Woods, but when the
not gonna happen.
We pull you over, bruh, you're Black.
Now, having that experience and that understanding of what it is to be in this space of you're not Ghanaian enough for certain Ghanaians, you're not American enough for certain Americans. Do you think that helps you better understand sort of the space that a lot of these biracial mixed people occupy, where they're like, oh, like I don't want to only identify as Black because I have a white parent, and I don't want to, exclude them from my identity because that's, hurtful, or like it's hard to be in this in-between space, which admittedly for me I've always been kind of like
What do you mean? You've always been like what?
I just always, and it comes from being someone who's never had to think about their identity in that context. So I'm sort of like, why is your identity so wrapped up? Like, I don't know, like I find it very interesting, people who like are very particular about not claiming Blackness fully, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And that's my thing,
So you're saying that you not taken issue, but that's been part of the struggle for you, is when folks don't.
Is when folks have an issue with being able to claim their Blackness as much as they claim their whiteness.
Yeah. I mean, I understand, and it's frustrating. And again, I think this is something that we've inherited in this space. right? Because of the ways that Blackness is regarded and disregarded by the state, or, you know, by the world that we live in. There's been, when we know history, we know that in the ways that folks have rejected Blackness, right,
Exactly.
and claimed other identities, it's been so that they could move closer towards whiteness. Like ultimately, all of these identity politics do nothing to dismantle whiteness. And whiteness is ultimately the problem. And so then we're fighting amongst and between ourselves, you know, and whiteness goes unscathed. And so I think there's a lot of, you know, of course, there are personal politics involved, right? In terms of how we see other people identifying, because we see that as a particular type of rejection, you know?
Yeah.
And so it becomes personal in that way, but also in naming the book One Drop, wanting to remind us of the legal definitions of Blackness. So many of us have inherited and taken on the one drop rule without really understanding what it represents. You know, so for a lot of folks, knowing the history, knowing the lived reality of that history, we're looking at folks like, you can call yourself whatever you want, but the world sees you as Black, right? And again, I'm not biracial, so I'm speaking to folks from their lived experience to understand what that experience is like, you know, in terms of coming up with an identity, and maybe not coming up with an identity, but how you come to name yourself and understand yourself given this world that we live in. And so for me, it was about really kind of sitting back and letting their stories lead so that I could understand. But the reality is, I think it is always going to be hard for us to understand each other's lived experiences, because like it or not, we tend to prioritize our own lived experience. And for someone who, again, prioritizes the political ramifications of identity, you know, it's like, okay, I hear you. I understand where you're coming from and why you identify in this way, but I also want to make sure that you understand the political implications of so doing.
Yeah. If
that makes sense.
Do you think, I mean, I think I know your answer to this question, but you know, I'm looking at the book and I'm seeing mixed people who don't look mixed. I'm seeing Black people with albinism. I'm seeing Black people with vitiligo. I'm seeing the vastness of Black identity, how it can't really be contained. Do you think like Blackness is definable or can ever be definable?
I guess the question is, what do we need to define it for? And again, I have more questions than answers, because I'm more interested in pushing us to have questions, right? And to think critically about this. But what I guess what I always hesitate about is Blackness was defined for us in a particular legal way, which created constraints, right? Do we want to reject that and move forward and come up with new definitions? Cool. How? What is that? Who? Not even just how. Who gets to do it? Right? Who's going to be in charge of defining Blackness, and based upon what? Because interestingly enough, speaking to what you mentioned earlier, beyond the DNA, beyond the genetics, right? There are a lot of ways that in this moment, we also think of Blackness in very stereotypical ways, such that if you don't eat certain things, if you don't listen to certain music, if you don't talk a particular way, if you're not named certain things, that's not Black either, you know? So I'm just wondering, in coming up with a definition, what would it be predicated on? Who would be able to do it, and for what purpose? Because we can't just be defining things arbitrarily. For what function will this definition serve us? Right.
Because the initial function of this whole thing was to preserve white supremacy. Yeah.
So what are we defining it for? Right? What do we need to draw these lines for, these hard lines about who's Black and who's not? And how will it benefit us? And again, the challenge is, in a lot of ways, I think we look to the structures that oppress us and replicate what they do, not recognizing how that will also oppress us, right? Because whiteness, on the one hand, I want to say white folks are very clear about who's white, but at the same time, know that whiteness has been negotiable because political ramification, right? So folks who are Jewish were not always white. Italians were not always white. In this moment, folks from Egypt are considered white. Who has made those determinations and why? There's been something at stake in so doing. So they've been able to negotiate whiteness based upon their definitions, right? What are we going to be negotiating Blackness based upon? And for what? Maybe I'm old school because I'm thinking, yes, in America, you may be 13% of the population, so we have a limited understanding of our identities. We see ourselves as a minority. What would happen if we expand that definition so that we understand that there are more of us than there are of them in the world, right? How can we have an expansive definition of Blackness that would serve us politically, right? That's how I'm thinking of it. And I don't know that we can afford to have hard lines based upon, again, who gets to define. Who would even come to the checkpoint?
Because these words, minority and marginalized, are kind of designed to make us think of ourselves in a certain way.
Absolutely.
You know, and so like, yeah, that's what I love about this book, is that it's suggesting that there is more expansiveness than we've been led to believe. Some of us have been led to believe.
And the other side of it too, to be clear, is that I don't think that Blackness is an identity that should be forced upon people.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think there's also a problem with that too. Like, if you don't want to be Black, don't be Black. Like, it's beautiful for our own sake. Blackness is beautiful to be projected as a punishment, because that's historically what has happened. It's been projected as a punishment. If you don't want to be Black, let me know how that works out for you. But if you don't want to be Black, you don't have to be. I'm not going to make you be Black, because there are a lot of folks who look like me who don't love me either, who don't love us either. We can't just be what we look like. Yeah.
And there's actually a quote from the book that I wanted to read that kind of dovetails with this, which is the one drop rule aside, have we abandoned our cultural and political understandings of Blackness for more phenotypical ones? Do we mean to suggest that Herman Cain is more Black than Benjamin Jealous? I certainly hope not, or we're in a heap of trouble, which I love that freaking quote. But can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's also, there's this notion of the cookout, who's invited and who's not invited to the cookout.
Ain't no cookout. The cookout is canceled. The cookout has not worked out for us because we're not having important enough conversations at the cookout.
Period. Yeah, no. And that's real. And it's just like, that adds another layer of this question of, it's so nebulous. I mean, do you ever get overwhelmed by all of this? No,
I wouldn't say overwhelmed. I think that I've grown up a lot in the work. Mm-hmm. I think if we had this conversation, even when I wrote the book, if we had this conversation when I was in grad school, I definitely had stronger opinions about who was what and who should be what and how you should be defining yourself. But again, in this moment, I'm in a space where it's like, we can't afford to be fighting about this. I just don't think we have the time and space to be fighting about it. So again, you can identify however you want. I'm interested in connecting with folks who are clear about their Blackness and understand the function of Blackness in a political space. Because again, if we look back historically, if we start drawing lines based upon people's lineage and or what people look like, I mean, it's Black History Month. So think of all the people that we're shouting out, right? What happens to W.E.B. Du Bois? Do we get to keep him? You know, do you get to keep Barack Obama? Do you get to keep Bob Marley? You know,
yeah.
Who gets, again, like, can we afford to draw these rigid lines? You know, because again, because of white supremacy, many of our leaders have had an approximation to whiteness to be in particular positions. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so again, I just think that it requires us to think more critically about surface understandings of what Blackness is. And for me, from a political perspective, I'm more interested in your commitment to Black people. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Daniel Cameron, dark as me. He don't love us.
Yeah.
Herman Cain, dark as me. He don't love us. There are lots of Black folks who are also agents of white supremacy and take on those same problematic understandings of Blackness, mm-hmm. right? And in their attempt, because again, they can't approximate whiteness based upon appearances, but you can still approximate whiteness based upon value system.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's nuance. We have to look beyond what folks are looking like.
And I guess that makes me wonder, there aren't necessarily answers here, but there are lots of questions. There are prompts. This is starting a conversation.
Sure.
Which I think is important. Where do you think this conversation goes? Like what's sort of next? At least in terms of the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, what's interesting, 10 years out, started the conversation with folks who don't quote unquote look Black to define Blackness. If there were a second iteration or a second part to this conversation, I'm absolutely interested in talking to folks who are recognizably Black, putting us in a position to define Blackness. I'm definitely interested in talking to folks who would identify as gatekeepers, right? To understand what are the lines you're drawing based upon what and why, what is the function of Blackness in this definition that you're creating. But I'm also interested in talking to white folks about their understandings of Blackness as well. Because what's so interesting, so much of the support for the book has come from white folks, right? Who are interested, right? But again, I always push back in this realm of diversity and inclusion that we have to stop thinking of diversity and inclusion as a trip to the zoo. This is not you picking up this book and saying, oh my God, look at what the colors are doing. This is so interesting. I had no idea. No, I need you to center yourself.
How does this... Yeah, exactly.
How does this impact you and your understandings of Blackness and your relationship to Black people, right? So instead of, again, looking outward, challenging us all to look inward.
Because at the end of the day, and that's why I kept coming back to going through all of these personal essays, is that this is a white fucking issue. This is something that they created. And to quote, I was about like, I give your problem back to you. I don't want to deal with this anymore. Like, the only way we're going to move forward is if you think about how and why you define yourself as white.
Mm-hmm. And also both
things. Yeah.
Because it is absolutely a problem founded in whiteness. We've absolutely taken it on.
Yeah.
So even in this conversation around Black Lives Matter, even in this conversation of anti-racism, I know a lot of us are sitting back, well, like, white people got a lot of work to do. We got a lot of work to do too.
That's true. Yeah.
We have to check ourselves because many of us don't recognize the white supremacist that lives within us. We're all agents of white supremacy to some degree. We have to figure out what it is, though.
That's tea. Oh my God. No, that's real. Yeah.
We all have work to do.
We all have work to do. And I think that having these questions, having these conversations begins that work.
Right. Work is also about being honest, right? Because if we're real, conversations about race, particularly one like this is in a public space,
yeah,
people are very committed to saying the right thing.
Oh, yes, because trust and believe, if there wasn't an audience, I would be saying all kinds of other things. Yeah.
We all are. We all have some sort of veneer on, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to get in trouble, right? And so for me, there's a lot at risk doing this work. And it was interesting. I was having a conversation with my agent and as well as, folks at Beacon. I was very frustrated before the book came out again. I had to work through some of my own stuff because I literally put myself on the front line. The time I put this book out there. What folks have to understand, for those of us who do work on race, particularly in the realm of social media, where everybody has an opinion, and oftentimes it's not an informed opinion, I put myself on the front line to be the receptor of people's shit. Personal shit that they won't name as personal. Everybody's speaking from a space of authority, like this is how race is, this is what racism is, right? People telling me I'm racist as if that's possible. You know what I mean? Or just you. I'm saying, no, look at you. Here is a mirror. Look at you. Right? And so I'm uncomfortable. And there was a large part of me that really wanted to downplay even the promotion of this book because Absolutely. I did this already. I can't tell you how many niggas I've been called in my email.
Wow.
I can't tell you the hate from Black folks that I've gotten in my email, or folks who dismiss the work because they somehow believe that I'm giving light-skinned folks a pass. You know what I mean? And so from a personal space, doing work on race can be painful. It wakes up your own stuff, but it's a position to have people project their own stuff onto you. Right? So people will say, that's not the way to say it. That's not the way to do it. You should have said it this way. I'm offended by what you said. I'm having an honest conversation though. And I'll take the L. If it means I'm going to grow and learn something, then I'm gonna take the L. I encourage you to take an L too. Put it out there. Put it out there. Get checked if you need to get checked. How else are you going to learn? How are you going to change?
And I love that you said that, and I really appreciate that you said that, because I think there is this constant fear of being wrong about something, not having the right take, being dragged, all these kinds of things. But I feel like, I mean, at least for me in the work that I'm doing, I've written a book about Black women in pop culture, and I'm so terrified of what the reaction is going to be. But it's like, I also understand that like I have to be open to critique. Yes. And be open to being potentially dragged in order to move forward in what I'm trying to understand about the things that I'm trying to communicate. Absolutely. You know?
And I had to have that conversation with myself. Of course, friends and loved ones had to have that conversation with me as well. And I also have to admit areas that I could work on. You know what I mean? Like, you know, in this moment, we bring up the example of Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal could have ended up in my book. I wasn't doing any kind of test, looking at people's bloodlines. Like if somebody had said, "Oh my God, you should talk to my friend Rachel because she looks like a white woman, but she's
right, or whatever her name is." Yeah.
What? And where would we be now? I'd be dragged for filth, right, for having Rachel in the book. But then also, quite honestly, I don't want anybody to pick up this book and say, Dr. Blay is an authority and she said these people are Black, therefore they are Black. No, I'm saying these people say they are Black. Listen to their story, right? So a learning curve for me, for example, and I'm interested in having this conversation. I just had a conversation with a group of Black women from quote unquote Latin America yesterday, but also learning their perspective, because this rubs them to have folks who look, you know, very white, identify as Afro Latinx is a problem for them. I'm not Afro Latinx. I'm not Latinx. I've never lived in Latin America. I have to sit back and listen. So on the one hand, yes, I want to hear your story. But on the other hand, Yaba, recognize how this might rub people who are Black and Latinx away. You should sit back and hear that also. So it's not to say, okay, y'all, this is the authority. Everybody's Black, move on. I don't want to hear nothing else about it and be completely defensive. What else is there for me to learn?
Yeah.
What else is there for me to understand? Because again, for all of us, we all have to like check our own selves and our experiences before we go out into the world speaking as authorities on people's experiences that we haven't lived.
Exactly. And it's perspective. Perspective is everything. And that's why I appreciate the methodology behind this, where it's like, you could have just done Q&A interviews, or you could have written for the stories of these people, like from your point of view, but everyone gets to kind of represent their personal experience in their own words.
Right.
And I think that's so effective, because it's like, okay, like I can't like be quick to like, okay, you look white, I don't know what the hell you're talking, but like, okay, let me read what you have to say. Let me understand your experience.
Right. And you may agree. And that's okay. But you listened. And what I'm saying is, even I'm thinking of myself and being very honest to say, because of the hurtful lived experiences that I had with people who looked a particular way, I was closed. I would not even listen. I wouldn't even be in a position to hear their lived experience. How much have I changed being open to at least listening? That's it.
Yeah. And it all comes down to that, because I think something I wrote in one of my notes about the book was I wrote, I think so much of the tension around this conversation is about erasure. No one wants their pain erased, right? So it's like I've been in situations with lighter skinned black identifying folks who've been like, you know, like I grew up, I was bullied by the dark skinned girl, you know, all these things, and I've just been like, what are you? That is irrelevant to me, because that you get into this game of sort of comparing trauma and comparing pain, and that does exactly, you know.
And so again, I too have been in that position, but it's to say, if I don't want my pain dismissed, I can't dismiss anybody else's pain. What they experience is real, right? But again, it doesn't mean that yours is more painful than mine. You know, like I feel like all of these conversations have to happen in order for us to ultimately recognize how we are not the problem. White supremacy is the problem. You had your go with it, I had my go with it. Connect the dots. White supremacy. That's it. But if we're constantly like this at each other, whiteness is over there unscathed. This is what I'm saying. Like, how do we work through our own stuff to get to some common recognition of what the problem is?
We need family therapy.
That's why the cookout is canceled. Unless the cookout is therapy, we're not having a cookout no more. Nobody's invited.
Period. You know. It's so much to think about. I know that we want to pivot to questions. People, get your questions in. Okay, here's the thing. Yaba, I know we don't want to give energy to the Rachel Dolezals of the world. I know we don't want to do it. I know we don't want to do it. But, you know, I recently rewatched her documentary on Netflix.
I didn't watch it.
You know, I mean, that's a good choice. Okay. But you know, in rewatching it, I thought a lot about the ways that Blackness. So when we talk about definitions of Blackness, the ways that Blackness can sort of be like extracted into these like identifiable markers and then performed.
Yes.
And people think that Blackness is all in the performance. So we don't have to talk about her, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about maybe what you think about, where you've discovered about that aspect of how people define Blackness in terms of, you know, dress, the things you eat, you know, like all these kinds of things. What's your sort of opinion on the relevance of these things?
I'm not sure. I want to make sure I'm understanding your question, but like if we use Rachel Dolezal as the example, the problem with her is that her performance of Blackness is predicated on a very stereotypical projection of Blackness.
Yeah.
All of us don't do the things that she did to claim her Blackness, and we're still Black. You know, I think again that we have to think expansively about Blackness. You know, because again, from a political perspective, if we understand Black as the bigger umbrella and all of our specific identifications falling under it, there's still things that connect us, no matter what you call it. You know, no matter what your individual identity is, Blackness is a larger political framework, right? That's going to look all kinds of ways. Again, we would be limiting ourselves if we came up with a checklist. I don't even know why that would be a goal. You cannot contain us. And why would you want to?
Why would you want to?
Unless you want to do something with it. Hello, this is why the definitions came up in the first place. You want to identify it so you can control it.
Yeah. And I think a lot about convenient Blackness. You know, I've been thinking a lot about Cardi B. I've been writing about her. And it's interesting, the moments when she's most adamant about her Blackness are the moments when she's called out for colorism, for, you know, for sort of like anti-Black aspects of her music. That's when she's quick to sort of be like, I am an Afro Latina.
I mean, I don't know. And maybe
okay.
I'm just pushing back to say that in the same way that I don't have to walk around saying that I'm Black, I just hesitate at this expectation that we have of people who aren't recognizably Black to kind of be, I'm Black.
There, yeah.
Just be, you know, and so I think it's interesting. And again, you know, we can talk about this more. But I think it's interesting that we have an expectation, you know, that she call out her Blackness as opposed to just being Black.
Okay, I think that's fair, because I do also think a lot about the conversations that people have about particularly light-skinned Black people overcompensating, like people saying that like this person is like almost too Afrocentric because they're trying to prove something. And then the question is, okay, like what are they trying to prove and how? Wait, sorry, I'm reading the comments. Sorry.
Okay.
I just want the panelists to understand that not identifying as just Black does not mean that the person who's doing so isn't in bed with white supremacy. I haven't felt that from the panelists' words for the discussion. What do you think about that?
The person who's doing it, I don't know that I said that. I don't know that we implied that necessarily. You know, if you look through the book, there are 58 people in the book who use all kinds of language to identify and still see themselves as Black. You know, they may not use the language of Black, they may say biracial, but again, when you read their narratives, they see themselves connected to Blackness, you know? So I don't think it's that cut and dry. Again, people have the freedom and flexibility to use whatever languaging best suits their own personal identity, but I certainly don't make the presumption that based upon how they identify, that automatically means that they're white, in bed with white supremacy.
Right.
What I'm trying to ultimately say is, even for those of us who are Blackity Black and walk around screaming that
we can also be in bed
with white supremacy. So I'm not sure.
It's interesting. Well, let's turn it over to some questions from the people in the room. Okay, so Tiffany B is asking, Yaba, could you speak about the impact of the one drop and its impact / creation of caste systems in Afro-Latino and Afro-Caribbean communities? Have you become more accepting of people that embrace both parts of their heritage, since Black is so varied, and identifying as Black, and not necessarily a negative if someone doesn't identify as just Black?
Yeah, I don't think that anyone again, there are no rules, right? So you can identify as you so please. But again, for me, what's most important is understanding that choice, right? And that we think bigger than just the naming, but what are the political implications of doing so? Mm-hmm. So in regards to the one drop rule is inherently an American legality, right? And the one drop rule essentially said that if you have as little as one drop, right, of Black blood, and so what they would do is look at your family line 5 generations back. And so if your great grandmother was Black, then they would make you Black. Initially, the rule was instituted to somehow attempt to deter, quote unquote, mixing, right? But ultimately what it did was really give mixing a pass, because what it meant then was if a white man were to rape a Black woman and have a child, he was not responsible for that child because that child was not white.
Yeah.
The child was the problem of parent. But connected to what the question is specifically about, say that again, Afro-Latin?
Yes, it's about, it's gone. The question's gone. Oh, it's gone, sorry. I think they were talking about Afro-Latino and Afro-Caribbean experience.
Right, and we see all kinds of codification. And again, in the book, let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, I was trying to find it.
There's this chart here.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to find, yeah.
But 100% makes you Negro, 1/8 Socotra, 1/4 Grife, like on and on, all the way down to that 1/32nd You know, we hear about quadroon balls and octoroon balls, but again, they were creating the stratification, right? Based upon how much blackness you had or how much whiteness you had, and coming up with an entirely new identity. And so again, just historically, this is also what is working against us from a political standpoint, right? That if you can't solidify a Black identity, you can't solidify necessarily a group of folks who are going to be pushing back against the oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You got folks who are categorized in all these different spaces. From my understanding, it's happened similarly, right, in Afro-Latin and Caribbean communities, that again, when we're thinking about a particular moment in time, particular plantation societies, is like white folks are clear about who's white and who's free. Everyone else who is oppressed is scattering for identities. And so from a political standpoint, right, it's what I guess impacted to some degree folks' ability to push back. Not sure if that answered the question. There was a second part to the question. Oh, but you said it's gone.
It's gone. Yeah, I can't find it. But we can move on to another one. This one is from Mahfouz, and they say, one effect of the pandemic I'm finding a bit strange is not being seen as Black in a work setting. I find the dialogue and approach I'm getting by just existing by email and phone has been really freeing. People are much more easier to work with. But I'm feeling guilty over being freed from dealing with how people react to my Blackness. Should I feel guilty?
I want to say no. I wouldn't. I mean, yeah, but I hear that, right? That if we're not engaged, but what about all the Zooms though? You know, you're still in people's faces with the Zooms, but that guilt in terms of representing, I think we can still represent in words. I think it's probably definitely more nuanced than a simple answer, because I think it would depend on the industry that you work in and the kind of work that you have to do. But that's interesting. I never thought about that, probably because I don't work for anybody else in this moment. And so I can control who I interact with, but that's interesting.
Yeah, it definitely is. Next question from Janelle. Who's saying, thank you both so much for this dialogue. How are both of you working to decenter whiteness and white supremacy in your life? Or, sorry about that. Or how are you prioritizing Black joy in your life right now?
Oh, well, you know, that's the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. I spend way too much time on social media. Zeba, you do a beautiful job as well. Zeba always gives us these carousels of Black joy and imagery and videos for us to center ourselves. And I think, you know, it's something that I think that I was committed to prior to the pandemic, but quarantine and us being glued to our screens and being, you know, the receptors of so much information, I think that there are many of us in this digital space who recognize that we also have to be committed to not just showing videos of us being murdered, but also reminding us that they've been trying to murder us since forever. And we have still found a way to smile, to laugh, to sing, to dance. Like we are the masters of so many undefeated, undisputed champions of the world when it comes to culture. And that sometimes we have to remind ourselves that even in the midst of all of this, we still find and make space for joy. So for me, I think from a professional standpoint, I'm committed to that in terms of the work that I share with the world. But quite honestly, there's still a challenge to experiencing joy on a personal level. So even in the ways that I speak about the work that I'm doing, you know, like I have a commitment to Black people. I want to do work in a particular way, but I'm also recognizing that this work can be very isolating, particularly in the space of a quarantine. I can't just go out and have a drink with my girlfriend, you know, and get it off of me or go dance it off. But then also in a digital space, putting myself on the front line to have particular conversations and to deal with other people's stuff. What does self-care look like in the space of quarantine, aside from trying to sleep? You know what I mean? Like, so I can admit that from a personal perspective, joy is also something that is hard to access sometimes doing the work that I do.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I kind of always just come back to the fact that you were talking about like the culture, you know, of Black joy. Because I think Black culture is Black joy. Absolutely. And I think that Black culture has also been medicine it's a healing medicine for us that everyone else gets to benefit from.
Absolutely.
And being able to meditate on that has given me a lot of peace, in especially in these days of like, what the hell is going on? Shit is getting real. Like, it's, you know, it's hard. But yeah, I agree. Like, it's easier for me to sort of like curate and, you know, hand it out to everyone else and be like, look at this. But for me to actually internalize it in my daily life, it's a struggle, you know, and that's real.
It is, but it's also affirming to know, you know, there's lots of things, you know, just in terms of social media and the things that I share, how much feedback I get from folks, you know, and I might just think, oh, I'm just sharing something crazy online or whatever, but how many people will reach out and thank me, you know, like, you're helping me to get through this moment. Like, I need this laugh, I need this joy, but to also know that in so curating it, there's also joy that I provide myself. Sometimes I need to be reminded.
It's a meditation to look at these things, to look at these memes, to look at these. It's a, you kind of, you realize that you are part of you're on a continuum of. I could cry just thinking about how
magic,
fucking amazing Black people are, you know.
And the thing that I'm always reminded of, again, in this moment, in the midst of all of the things that we have had to deal with, 2019, 2020, now into 2021, and folks still have time to dance and send videos. Folks still have time to create memes for the express purpose of making us laugh. You know what I mean? Like, who else can do that?
No one.
Generations of attempted murder and suicide, and still, you know, we're experiencing joy. But I think we also just have to prioritize that self-care. And I remind myself, I remind my colleagues that yes, doing this work is heavy. Yes, doing this work is necessary, but doing this work will take me out if I'm not careful. So I also have to shore up, you know, in my own spiritual work. I miss my spiritual community. I'm a priest in the Lukumi tradition. And when we gather, we sing and we dance, and spirit moves us in this way. We haven't been able to do so, right? Because of quarantine, because of COVID. So sometimes I need to just put on my music and dance in front of my Orisha by myself. You know what I mean? Like, we have to be deliberate about the ways that we feed ourselves. And I think it's easy to forget, particularly being isolated. Now there is no 9 to 5 clock out. I could be up till 2 o'clock in the morning working.
Yeah.
Who's going to tell me to go to bed?
No one.
The next day, the emails are still asking me about deadlines and things that are due. Like, and I think that's the thing that's also dangerous about this moment. We are doing this to each other, right? We're still giving each other deadlines. We're still acting like we got to go.
It's wild. I'm just like, nothing is that urgent. Nothing that is that important to be emailing me on a Saturday about, like, no. I refuse. We have 2 more questions. This one is from Jacqueline Woodson, who's asking, I love what you're doing in this book, and this conversation is so long overdue. My question is twofold. What has been the reception, and are the conversations that you're having on this tour at all surprising? If so, how?
The reception has been amazing. So we started pre-orders of the book, I want to say in December. The book was released last Tuesday. Within 24 hours, the book was sold out. It's on back order now, which is amazing. It's a little frustrating still because it's a full color book. So whereas, you know, prior to quarantine, we might have been able to get it back in the warehouse within 2 weeks. Now it's going to take upwards of 4 weeks. It's frustrating. I hope it doesn't discourage folks from still placing their order and waiting patiently for the book to come. I think it's worth having. The feedback has been, honestly, so much different than the first time around. The first time around, I definitely feel like I caught a lot of heat, primarily from, if I'm honest, white mothers of mixed race children and folks who are themselves mixed race, who felt like I was forcing them to be Black. They felt like I was saying, by way of this book, that folks who have multiple identities are by default Black. Many folks who didn't even crack the book open or learn or read anything about it saw the title and assumed that I was bigging up the one drop rule, right? And so the first time around, particularly because the last iteration of Black in America was based upon the book, which you can find it on YouTube. I think I have it connected to my YouTube channel. But this, Soledad O'Brien is in the book. The whole documentary is talking to folks from mixed race backgrounds and how they identify, some struggling, some very clear. And just, it felt much more tense the first time around. I don't feel that way this time. This time feels a lot more affirming. And so I'm not sure if it's because conversations have changed in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
People are more open, or it could just be that now that it's been acquired by a press, that the reach is bigger and broader. And so that was different conversations, and the conversations that I was just able to, I think, generate from my own circles. But I'm nothing yet, knock on wood. It's only been a week, but nothing surprising yet. I think if anything, I am surprised at how receptive white folks have been to the conversation. Because again, first time around, it felt like it was isolated, primarily to Black folks, and then white folks who were connected to mixed race people in their family. This time around, and again, it might be because, Beacon acquired it, so there's a larger reach, and it could be the moment, because I think this moment, there's so many folks who are so much more interested. So many folks are creating book lists and resources, and this is what you should be reading, and these are the kinds of questions you should be asking. So I think there are a lot more folks who are maybe open in different ways than they were maybe 10 years ago. But yeah, so far so good.
That makes me happy. Okay, we have the final question or comment from Emily saying, firstly, thank you for holding space and for sharing your essential spirits and knowledge. Would you be able to elaborate more on the politics of Blackness as it relates to voting blocks, if that makes sense? Example, Blackness is treated as a monolith, so Black folks are feeling forced to vote solely Black issues rather than fiscal policy, foreign policy, domestic infrastructure, etc. Thank you so much. So honored to be in community.
Thank you for the question. I usually run away from questions around politics because I'm admittedly not as well versed, but I do think it's something for us to think about. And I think when you were reading the question, I was just thinking about how, and again, thinking of myself, how much I don't know about the political sphere, which may or may not also be by design, right? I don't even know how the system, honestly, I don't know well enough how the system works. And I think, and I don't want to make an assumption, but I'm wondering if that is also the case for many of us, right? That we know it's important to vote, right? We look around to see who our friends and family are voting for. We look around to see who our leaders tell us to vote for based upon what they've identified as the issue. But I wonder if we as individuals and as a community know how to think critically about the political realm enough to make informed decisions about who has our best interests at heart. Because again, it could be a Black candidate. Doesn't mean that person has our best interests at heart. They look like us, but what will they ultimately do for and to us if they're in office, right? So again, more questions than answers, but I like where the question is coming from and where it's going. I do think that we need the education, right? We need the exposure and some guidance on how to think critically about our relationship to the state, our relationship to the government structure in general, because I know I can only speak for myself. There's so much I don't know.
Oh yeah. I mean, I know for me as a newly naturalized citizen, someone who's been an immigrant for most of my life, I just always felt like, okay, like this is not for me because I'm an immigrant. I'm not supposed to engage with this because I don't have the right, And as you say, that I feel like a lot of that is by design. And yeah, like having these conversations, thinking about Blackness even also forces me to think about citizenship, to think about nationality, just to think about all the layers of identity that are prescribed to me and that I then engage with.
Right. Also making me think of, again, in that political sphere, again, when we're thinking about, all the Black folks who are rocking their MAGA hats, and how many of us were surprised, like, how can you be Black and be Republican? But there are lots of Black Republicans. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because again, I think there are people who are clear about, their political alignments for whatever reasons, right? Mm-hmm. I can only speak for myself. I know a lot of Black folks in my circle. You Black, you're Democrat.
Yeah.
What's that mean? You know what I mean? Like, what is it that we're, what are we aligned with? Or is it just by default? You Black, you Democrat. We don't ask any questions. Tell me who to vote for. I vote.
Yeah.
So I think that is engaging more critical with the political structure in general, and also know that we have more options than Democrat and Republican also.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's like, and it goes back to these binaries, these categories that we're just given, and then we're expected to just like, okay, like this is what Black means, this is what white means, this is the political affiliation that I have to, sort of follow. But thinking more about how do I define my identity for myself? What is my experience?
Right. And that though, right? Because I also think there are layers and there's time and place. There's a time to think about ourselves as individuals. Then there's a time for us to think about ourselves as a collective. And at one point does one, you know what I mean? Like at what point does one overweigh the other? And so again, thinking towards this question and thinking of the folks who I've heard about, because I don't know any, who are Black and Republican, and the kind of reasoning, right, that they have for their political affiliations. And a lot of it sounds very individualistic to some degree, right? Absolutely informed by capitalism, absolutely informed by their potential for individual success or the success of their business, right? Which would again make me wonder, when we're thinking of our alignment with political systems, which comes first? Is it about how you're going to fare as an individual? Is it about how your community is going to fare? Or should you even be required to think of your community? Isn't that the American way? To think of yourself? Again, more questions than answers, but I don't know that we're having enough conversations that are healthy and patient enough, right?
Patient.
Right? To say to me, grown woman with a PhD who's admitting that I don't know enough about the political framework to answer, right? And not judge me for not knowing, you know what I mean? Like, where are the spaces that we can have free and open conversations so that I can learn without being shamed?
Yeah.
Because we make assumptions. You ought to know. And so then we don't have the conversation. But you jumping in to cut us off? It's time to go.
Sorry, no, I was getting prepped to, but please finish the thought. I will reappear in a second.
No, but again, just to say, I think, and that's across the board, not just politics. Like
everything.
Comments, Emily saying, I don't know, is so powerful. Sometimes we got to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know.
Yo, like that is where I'm at right now. It's like so much of my anxiety in life comes from appearing like I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, or like I don't know what, and actually to not know is actually it's exciting. Like to be curious and to learn is actually so much more stimulating than to just feel like you know everything.
Or act like you know.
Or act
that you know, because that's closing the door right there. If you go around acting like you got all the answers, right? Who's going to give you more information? Because
Exactly. So I think the thing to take away from this brilliant, amazing, phenomenal book is that we don't have all the answers, that there's always more room to learn. There's always more room to ask questions and to challenge ourselves. And it's through challenging ourselves that we grow. So thank you. I'm so grateful for you and for this.
For you, Zeba. Thank you so much for hosting me tonight. And thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for the book. Y'all see that button that says purchase? Good folks at Strand will make sure, because I actually think the bookstores actually have more copies. If you go to Amazon and elsewhere, you probably won't get it. But I bet you if you press this button, Strand might have a few for you.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Dr. Blay, for that plug. So please feel free, if you haven't purchased a copy of One Drop, to just click on the green button. We also dropped a pre-order link for Zeba's book, Carefree Black Girl, in the chat
Yay!
as well. So if you want to take a look at it, please feel free to click there. And then thank you, both of you, for a fantastic, interesting, and edifying conversation. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you to our audience for participating tonight and for spending your Tuesday night with us.
Yeah.
So, on that note, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Yeah. Good night, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.